Sometimes the biggest disappointment isn't a bad movie. It's a movie that should have been great. You know the feeling. The trailer looks incredible. The cast is stacked. The director has a legendary track record. The budget is massive. And then the lights go down. And slowly, painfully, reality sets in. These aren't movies that failed because no one cared. They failed because everyone cared. Some had decades of anticipation behind them. Others promised to launch entire franchises. A few came from filmmakers we trusted without question. And yet, somehow, they collapsed under the weight of their own ambition. Whether it was misguided creative choices, tonal chaos, studio interference, or stories that simply didn't work on screen, these films didn't just underperform, they let audiences down. Tonight, we're counting down the movies that couldn't live up to the hype. The ones that promised greatness, but delivered confusion, frustration, or outright boredom. If you've ever walked out of a theater thinking, "How did this go so wrong?" You're not alone. Let's break them down. Got it. Continuing cleanly from the intro. Here are the next entries. Number 20 through number 16, rewritten in a polished, Watch Mojo-style narrative. Number 20, Megalopolis. When Francis Ford Coppola announces a new film, expectations aren't just high, they're historic. Megalopolis carried decades of anticipation, a massive personal investment, and the promise of a visionary filmmaker returning with something bold and profound. What audiences received, however, felt less like a masterpiece and more like a bewildering experiment that never quite came together. The film attempts to blend science fiction, ancient Roman philosophy, political allegory, and Shakespearean ambition into a single narrative. On paper, that sounds daring. On screen, it becomes overwhelming. Adam Driver plays an idealistic architect hoping to reshape society, but his character feels more like a symbol than a person. Scenes drift between sincerity and unintentional absurdity, often leaving viewers unsure whether they're meant to be inspired or amused. One of the biggest issues is tonal confusion. Performances clash dramatically. Some actors deliver restrained drama, while others appear to be in entirely different films. The dialogue leans heavily into grand speeches and philosophical musings, but without emotional grounding, those moments feel hollow rather than powerful. Visually, Megalopolis is undeniably striking. The sets, costumes, and scale are impressive. Unfortunately, spectacle alone can't save a story that struggles to connect its ideas in a meaningful way. Instead of feeling like a bold statement about society and power, the film often plays like an overstuffed lecture dressed up as cinema. For many viewers, the disappointment wasn't that Megalopolis was bad. It was that it was confusing, self-serious, and oddly lifeless. When a legend swings this big and misses, the letdown feels even heavier. Number 19, Jem and the Holograms. A live-action Jem and the Holograms should have been an easy win. The original animated series was colorful, futuristic, and unapologetically fun. Fans expected music, glamour, sci-fi flair, and camp. What they got instead felt like a toned-down Disney Channel movie stripped of everything that made the property unique. Rather than leaning into its neon, hologram-driven roots, the film grounds itself in a bland, reality-adjacent story about viral fame and family drama. The iconic sci-fi elements are minimized, replaced by a scavenger hunt plot involving a robot left behind by the protagonist's father, an idea that could have been touching but never fully lands. Musically, the film stumbles even more. For a franchise built around pop spectacle, the songs are shockingly forgettable. The performances lack energy, and the film never captures the sense of rebellion or extravagance that defined the original series. Even a supporting cast filled with recognizable names can't elevate the material. The tone feels cautious, sanitized, and confused about who it's actually for. Longtime fans felt alienated, while newcomers were left with a generic coming-of-age story that didn't stand out. In trying to modernize Jem, the film forgot what made it special in the first place: boldness. The result wasn't just disappointing, it was forgettable, which might be the worst fate of all. Number 18, Terminator Genisys. By the time Terminator Genisys arrived, the franchise was already struggling to recapture its former glory. Still, fans held out hope. The return of Arnold Schwarzenegger and the promise of a timeline-shattering reboot suggested something daring. Instead, the film became a messy remix of ideas better executed decades earlier. Genisys attempts to reboot, remake, and sequel the franchise all at once. Familiar scenes from the original film are recreated with digital trickery, but instead of feeling clever, they come across as hollow nostalgia. The film constantly reminds viewers of how good the earlier movies were, without offering anything new to match them. Casting choices further complicate matters. Emilia Clarke and Jai Courtney never quite convince as the next generation of heroes, and the decision to turn John Connor into a villain, arguably the film's most interesting idea, is rushed and underdeveloped. The plot becomes increasingly convoluted, drowning itself in exposition about timelines, paradoxes, and alternate futures. What once felt like a tight sci-fi thriller becomes an exhausting puzzle with little emotional payoff. Rather than revitalizing the series, Terminator Genisys highlighted how difficult it is to resurrect a franchise without understanding what made it great to begin with. Simplicity, tension, and character-driven stakes. Number 17, Artemis Fowl. Artemis Fowl had everything needed for success: a popular book series, a young anti-hero, and a world rich with fantasy and intrigue. Instead, the film delivered one of the most bafflingly bland adaptations in recent memory. Rather than embracing the clever, morally ambiguous tone of the novels, the movie softens Artemis into a conventional hero. The sharp edge that defined the character is removed, leaving behind a generic protagonist in an overly simplified plot. The pacing is rushed, exposition-heavy, and oddly lifeless. World-building that should have felt magical instead feels mechanical, as if the film is checking off story requirements rather than telling a story. Visual effects overwhelm character moments, and tonal shifts make it hard to know whether the movie wants to be epic, comedic, or heartfelt. Perhaps most frustrating is how cautious it feels. Instead of committing to bold fantasy or thrilling adventure, Artemis Fowl plays everything safe, and in doing so, loses its identity entirely. Number 16, The Bonfire of the Vanities. On paper, The Bonfire of the Vanities looked unstoppable. A best-selling novel, a prestigious director, a cast stacked with stars. Yet the final product became a textbook example of how prestige doesn't guarantee success. The story, meant to satirize wealth, power, and media corruption, loses its bite almost immediately. Tom Hanks, cast against type, struggles to embody the morally hollow protagonist. The sharp social critique of the novel is softened into something strangely toothless. Director Brian De Palma's strengths lie in suspense and stylized thrillers, not broad social satire. The result feels misaligned at every level. Scenes rush past important themes while lingering too long on moments that add little. What should have been a biting examination of class and hypocrisy becomes a curiosity, remembered less for its message. Number 15, Exorcist II: The Heretic. Following The Exorcist was always going to be risky. Following it like this was catastrophic. The original 1973 film wasn't just a horror classic, it redefined the genre. It was terrifying, grounded, and emotionally devastating. Expectations for the sequel were sky high. What audiences got instead was a baffling mix of mysticism, experimental visuals, and narrative choices that felt disconnected from everything that came before. Linda Blair returned as Reagan, now trying to live a normal life. That premise alone had potential. But instead of exploring trauma or lingering psychological scars, the film dives into hypnosis, telepathic visions, and pseudo-spiritual science. The tone shifts constantly, never settling on horror, drama, or fantasy. Director John Boorman clearly wanted to make something bold and unconventional. Unfortunately, bold doesn't always mean effective. The story becomes increasingly abstract, asking audiences to accept concepts without emotional grounding or logical consistency. Even the impressive cast, including Richard Burton and James Earl Jones, can't anchor the chaos. Their performances feel disconnected, as if they're acting in entirely different movies, turning one of cinema's greatest horror franchises into an accidental cautionary tale. Number 14, Righteous Kill. When Robert De Niro and Al Pacino share the screen, expectations are automatic. Their history together practically guarantees intensity. That's what makes Righteous Kill such a letdown. Marketed as a gritty crime thriller, the film promised a return to the electric energy of Heat. Instead, it delivered a sluggish, predictable story that wastes two of cinema's greatest actors. De Niro and Pacino play veteran NYPD detectives hunting a vigilante serial killer. The setup is familiar, but execution is painfully uninspired. The plot unfolds exactly as expected, with twists that feel telegraphed long before they arrive. Worse, the dialogue feels strangely artificial. Conversations lack the spark and tension audiences associate with these performers. Rather than elevating the material, the actors seem constrained by it, forced into cliches and tired exchanges. The supporting cast doesn't help much either, and tonal misfires undercut what little suspense exists. For a film built on star power, Righteous Kill feels oddly small and forgettable. The disappointment here isn't just about quality. Number 13, J. Edgar. A Clint Eastwood-directed biopic starring Leonardo DiCaprio as FBI founder J. Edgar Hoover sounds like a guaranteed awards contender. Instead, it became one of the most underwhelming prestige films of its era. The problem isn't ambition, it's focus. J. Edgar attempts to cover decades of history, political intrigue, and personal conflict, but never finds a compelling emotional core. Scenes feel episodic, drifting from one historical moment to another without momentum. DiCaprio commits fully, but his performance is hampered by distracting makeup and a stiff accent that draws attention away from the character. Rather than disappearing into the role, he feels trapped under layers of prosthetics and restraint. More frustrating is how little the film explores the truly controversial aspects of Hoover's legacy. The FBI's abuses of power, surveillance tactics, and political manipulation are present, but rarely interrogated with urgency or depth. Instead of feeling like a sharp examination of authority, the film plays it safe. For a subject this complex and a creative team this accomplished, J. Edgar ends up feeling inert, a history lesson without bite. Number 12, Cherry. After redefining blockbuster filmmaking with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Russo brothers seemed poised to conquer prestige drama. Cherry was meant to prove that range. Instead, it exposed the limits of their approach. Tom Holland stars as a traumatized veteran spiraling into addiction and crime. It's a dark, challenging role, but one that never quite fits him. Holland tries hard, but the film's tone swings wildly between gritty realism and stylized excess. The story itself is familiar territory. War trauma, opioid addiction, moral collapse. Films have explored this ground with far more nuance and restraint. Cherry opts for flashy techniques, aggressive camera moves, voiceover, tonal gimmicks that distract rather than enhance. Instead of immersing viewers in emotional devastation, the film keeps reminding them they're watching something important. Number 11, The Counselor. On paper, The Counselor sounds unstoppable. Ridley Scott directing a script by Cormac McCarthy, with a cast including Michael Fassbender, Javier Bardem, Cameron Diaz, Brad Pitt, and Penelope Cruz. On screen, it's a mess. The film follows a lawyer who gets involved in drug trafficking, only to spiral toward inevitable doom. That fatalism is classic McCarthy, but his dense philosophical dialogue doesn't translate smoothly to film. Characters speak in long, cryptic monologues that feel more literary than cinematic. Conversations drag, tension dissipates, and scenes often feel disconnected from one another. Even talented actors struggle to make sense of their roles. Some performances veer into camp, others into monotone seriousness. Brad Pitt's limited screen time feels wasted, while Cameron Diaz's infamous scene became more meme than menace. Rather than a gripping crime thriller, The Counselor feels like an intellectual exercise that forgot to engage its audience. It's not boring by accident, it's boring by design. Number 10, Jurassic World Dominion. By the time Jurassic World Dominion arrived, audiences had already invested nearly 3 decades into this franchise. The promise was simple but powerful. Unite the original Jurassic Park cast with the new generation and deliver a grand finale worthy of the name. What we got felt oddly small. Instead of focusing on the awe and terror of humans coexisting with dinosaurs, the film detours into a convoluted subplot involving genetically engineered locusts. Dinosaurs, the very reason people showed up, often feel like background noise rather than the driving force. The returning legends, Laura Dern, Sam Neill, and Jeff Goldblum, are undeniably charming, but they're underserved by a plot that never gives them room to breathe. Their presence feels more like fan service than narrative necessity. Meanwhile, the newer characters tread familiar ground without emotional escalation. The movie tries to balance nostalgia, action, and sci-fi commentary, but never commits fully to any of it. For a supposed culmination, Dominion lacks urgency. Instead of closing the book with wonder or terror, it fades out quietly, a baffling end to a franchise built on spectacle. Number 9, Joker, Folie à Deux. The original Joker was divisive but undeniably impactful. A sequel immediately raised eyebrows, especially when it was revealed to be a musical. Folie à Deux doubles down on that gamble. Set largely within Arkham Asylum and the courtroom, the film leans heavily into stylized musical numbers that disrupt momentum rather than deepen character. Joaquin Phoenix remains committed, and Lady Gaga brings intensity, but commitment can't save a concept that alienates its audience. The songs don't advance the story in a meaningful way. Instead, they stall it. What once felt like an unsettling psychological descent now feels theatrical in the wrong sense, staged rather than disturbing. By the time the trial narrative reaches its conclusion, the film seems unsure what it wants to say. Is it condemning spectacle? Indulging in it? The answer never becomes clear. As a follow-up to a cultural phenomenon, Folie à Deux feels self-satisfied and oddly hollow, a sequel that mistakes boldness for depth. Number 8, Heaven's Gate. Few films are as infamous as Heaven's Gate. Released after director Michael Cimino's massive success with The Deer Hunter, expectations were sky high. What followed became one of the most legendary misfires in Hollywood history. The film is undeniably ambitious, sprawling sets, period detail, and an epic scope rarely attempted. But ambition without restraint proved fatal. At nearly 4 hours in its original cut, the narrative drags relentlessly. Scenes linger long past their emotional value, and the story's political themes are buried beneath excess. Audiences at the time were baffled. Critics were brutal. United Artists suffered catastrophic financial damage, effectively ending the era of unchecked director control. In later years, some have reassessed Heaven's Gate more kindly, praising its visuals and intent. Even so, it remains a cautionary tale, proof that scale alone doesn't guarantee engagement. Number 7, Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice. On paper, Batman vs. Superman should have been foolproof. Two of the most iconic characters in pop culture finally clashing on screen. Instead, the film buckles under its own seriousness. The tone is relentlessly grim, draining the fun and heroism audiences expect. Batman is violent and brooding, Superman distant and joyless. Their conflict feels forced rather than inevitable. The infamous Martha moment, meant to resolve their feud, instead became a symbol of tonal miscalculation. Emotional logic gives way to awkward coincidence. While Zack Snyder's visual style delivers striking imagery, storytelling suffers. The movie also rushes to set up future franchise entries, crowding the narrative with teases rather than focus. Rather than launching a coherent universe, Batman v Superman fractured audience trust, something DC spent years trying to rebuild. Number 6. The Dark Tower. Adapting Stephen King's Dark Tower saga was always risky. Compressing 8 novels into a single film, however, was nearly impossible. The result is a rushed, confusing experience that satisfies neither newcomers nor longtime fans. Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey are both talented, but they're stranded in a script that strips the story of its mythology and emotional weight. The film speeds through concepts that deserved hours of exploration. World building feels superficial, and stakes never fully register. Instead of an epic fantasy western hybrid, audiences get a hollow summary of a much richer universe. The Dark Tower doesn't fail because of lack of effort. It fails because it misunderstands its source material. Some stories simply need time, patience, and respect. Here's the final stretch of the countdown. Number 5 to number 1, followed by a clean, natural CTA. Same tone, measured, critical, audience-aware, no channel name. Number 5, Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. Few movies carry expectations as heavy as the final chapter of the Star Wars Skywalker saga. The Rise of Skywalker wasn't just another sequel. It was meant to close a story that had spanned more than 40 years. Instead, it felt like a frantic attempt to undo, redo, and rush through everything at once. From the opening crawl, the film is in panic mode. Major revelations, including the sudden return of Emperor Palpatine, are dropped with little buildup. Plot points race by so quickly that none are allowed to breathe. Emotional moments feel unearned because the film doesn't slow down long enough to earn them. Characters change motivations abruptly. Relationships are hinted at, then abandoned. Entire arcs feel like damage control rather than storytelling. It's clear the film is reacting to fan backlash, to divided reception of the previous entry, instead of confidently concluding a narrative. The result is a movie that's loud, busy, and strangely hollow. It checks boxes but leaves little behind. For a saga built on myth, wonder, and emotional resonance, ending with confusion and exhaustion was deeply disappointing. Number 4, Eternals. With an Oscar-winning director and a diverse ensemble cast, Eternals was positioned as Marvel's boldest experiment. Instead, it became one of the studio's most divisive entries. The film introduces a massive cast of immortal beings, each with their own history and philosophy. That scope sounds exciting, until you realize the movie doesn't have time to develop them meaningfully. Characters are introduced rapidly, then sidelined just as quickly. Director Chloe Zhao's contemplative style clashes with Marvel's formula. The movie wants to explore humanity, purpose, and free will, but it's constantly interrupted by exposition dumps and obligatory action beats. Visually, it's often stunning. Emotionally, it struggles to connect. For a story about beings who've watched humanity evolve, the film feels oddly distant and cold. The disappointment isn't that Eternals tried something different. It's that it never found a balance between ambition and engagement. Number 3, X-Men Origins: Wolverine. Hugh Jackman's Wolverine was one of the most beloved elements of the X-Men franchise, making this solo film a guaranteed crowd pleaser, at least in theory. In practice, it became a textbook example of how not to handle a character-driven story. The film is overloaded with subplots, rushed origin beats, and awkward world building. Instead of focusing on Logan's pain and identity, it tries to introduce half a dozen characters and set up future spin-offs. The most infamous misstep is Deadpool. Stripped of his personality, stitched mouth, and reduced to a bizarre, silent weapon. For fans, it felt like a betrayal. Jackman does his best, but even his commitment can't save a film that misunderstands what makes Wolverine compelling: restraint, rage, and humanity. Number 2, The Mummy. This film wasn't just a reboot, it was supposed to launch an entire cinematic universe. Universal's dark universe aimed to modernize classic monsters with blockbuster energy. The Mummy was the foundation, and it collapsed immediately. Tom Cruise's presence dominates the film, pushing the horror aside in favor of action spectacle. The tone is confused, part adventure, part comedy, part horror, but none of it fully works. Instead of letting mystery and atmosphere build, the movie rushes through mythology, exposition, and franchise setup. Russell Crowe's Dr. Jekyll feels more like a teaser than a character. The audience reaction was swift, poor reviews, weak word of mouth. The dark universe was quietly abandoned. Few films have failed so completely at doing the one thing they were designed to do: begin something bigger. Number 1, Fantastic Four. If disappointment had a blueprint, it would look like this. The 2015 Fantastic Four reboot arrived with a talented cast and the promise of a darker, more grounded take on Marvel's first family. What emerged was a lifeless, fragmented film that felt unfinished even on release. The pacing is disastrous. The first half drags through setup, while the second half rushes through conflict with barely any emotional payoff. Characters lack chemistry. The tone is bleak without being compelling. Behind-the-scenes turmoil only made things worse. Reshoots, studio interference, and creative clashes resulted in a movie that feels stitched together rather than directed. Perhaps the biggest sin is boredom. Even with cosmic powers and a legendary villain, the film rarely feels exciting. For a property built on imagination and teamwork, this adaptation delivered neither, cementing its place as one of the most disappointing blockbusters of its era. Some movies fail quietly, others fail loudly, and some fail so spectacularly they become cautionary tales. Which of these letdowns hurt you the most? And which movie did you walk into expecting greatness, only to leave disappointed? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into cinema's biggest misses, misfires, and missed opportunities.